My husband's best friend satisfied me better than he did. That's the truth I hide so much. Thank you for the opportunity that the Meat Lover channel has given me. My name is Sarah. I'm 32 years old, and I'm a graphic designer in Los Angeles. I met James when we were still in college, and for a long time, our marriage was full of promises and shared dreams. But as the years went by, he devoted himself so much to work that I found myself alone at home, waiting for a sign that our relationship still mattered. James was once again out of town on a business trip for an important project, which had become routine. I ran my fingers along the cold wall, trying to reconnect with something that always seemed far away, home, the place where I had once imagined a future full of laughter and endless conversations. Now, all I felt was an echo, the echo of my own loneliness. I had gotten used to it, to the emptiness of the nights when he wasn't home. During the day, it was easy to fool the mind. I worked as a graphic designer, surrounded by canvases and colors, where I took refuge in my creations. But at night, the silence became deafening, and even with social media messages and friends, I felt more and more alone. It was during this period of loneliness that Matthew began to approach me. He was James's best friend, always there with an easy smile and a way of being present without intruding. At first, our conversations were simple. A hi, how are you? Here, a light-hearted joke there. No big deal. I knew he was just being kind, as he always was, but there was something in his gestures that began to make me realize how alone I felt. It wasn't an immediate attraction, but a comfort I didn't know I needed. In the first few months, Matthew began to come around more often, perhaps because he was more aware of my situation, or simply because he, like me, also felt distant from what was happening to the others. I never knew exactly why, but we started talking more often. Sometimes he would call me to see how I was, ask if I wanted to go out for dinner or coffee. At first, these conversations were casual, but soon something began to change. One evening, James had told me that he would be away for a few more days with a project that would keep him busy. I knew what that meant. More sleepless nights, more lonely dinners, and more hours spent trying to fill a void that seemed to be growing. Then, the moment my cell phone vibrated on the kitchen table, it was Matthew who appeared on the screen. It was a simple message. Hi, Sarah, I know James is away. How about a coffee? I think you deserve a break from this loneliness. I stared at the screen for a long moment, wondering what to do. On the one hand, he was just a friend of my husband. On the other, the invitation was an escape, a chance to get out of myself, to breathe something other than the emptiness that was beginning to consume my life. So I decided to accept. We met in a charming cafe in the city center, a place that, although busy, always seemed welcoming and intimate. Matthew was there as always with his calm smile and eyes that shone with an understanding that made me feel that he knew exactly what was going on inside me. He didn't ask directly about my marriage, but he made a point of taking an interest in how I was feeling, what I wanted to do with my life. His every word seemed to echo in my heart, as if he was really listening to me. Matthew was different from James. He wasn't so distant, so immersed in his work that he didn't notice what was going on around him. He cared, and that attention made me feel alive. Every conversation seemed to fill a piece of me that had been ignored, and his smile warmed my heart. I knew it was wrong. He was James's best friend, and I was betraying his trust, but at the same time, I couldn't resist. The attraction I felt for Matthew wasn't just physical. There was something much deeper, something that made me want to be with him, even though I knew I was moving away from everything I had always considered right. At the time, I still believed that I could go back to what I had with James, that maybe it was just a phase. But every time Matthew was around, something told me that my life was changing, and I didn't know how to go back. I was in a dilemma, one that had consumed me over the last few days. Matthew had become an increasingly constant presence, and something inside me knew that this wasn't the right path. But the pain of loneliness made me ignore any sense of guilt. I just wanted to feel something, anything. So when he called me that night saying he wanted to go out, that I deserved a break, I didn't hesitate. The invitation felt like an escape from what was suffocating me. I knew that night would be different. Something in Matthew's tone of voice told me that he too sensed that something was about to happen. After a few more messages, I arranged to meet him. He suggested an Italian restaurant, a small, cozy place in the city center that he knew I loved. It was late, and the streets of Los Angeles were quiet, without the usual traffic frenzy. The city lights reflected in the closed store windows, and I felt distanced from the real world, as if I had been transported to another place. I arrived at the restaurant a little before Matthew. The place was quiet, with candles on the tables and soft music playing in the background. The scent of garlic and fresh herbs filled the room. The decor, simple but elegant, created a welcoming atmosphere, and I allowed myself to relax, even though I knew I was in dangerous territory. The place seemed almost empty, except for a table at the back, where a couple were dining in silence without saying a word. Everything seemed perfectly calm and tense at the same time. Matthew arrived shortly afterwards. He wore a dark shirt and jeans that, although simple, highlighted his body in a way that I couldn't ignore. When he walked in, his eyes met mine instantly, as if there was an invisible connection between us, a tension in the air that couldn't be disguised. He smiled, that easy smile, but there was something different there, something that made me feel a warmth in my chest. "Hi, Sarah, you look beautiful." His voice was low, deep, and there was a sincerity in it that made me feel something I could no longer deny. He walked over, gave me a quick kiss on the cheek, and sat down in front of me, his eyes still fixed on me, as if he was reading all the thoughts I was trying to hide. "Thank you, Matthew. I think I'm more tired today than I'd like to admit." I gave a forced smile, trying to hide the whirlwind of feelings that was beginning to grow inside me. He understood. Of course he did. The conversation flowed unhurriedly, but in a different way. There were no more small jokes or superficial comments. Our words began to go deeper, touching on points we had never discussed before. I talked about my marriage, about how I felt left out, about the lonely nights that were starting to pile up. He listened attentively, and his eyes seemed to understand me in a way that James had never been able to do. He wasn't just listening, he was feeling what I was feeling. The evening passed quickly. Dinner was delicious, and the wine did its part, softening the boundaries between us. After a while, he took my hand gently but firmly. I didn't know what to do, what to think, but something inside me was ready to let go. His touch was warm, comforting. I knew I should pull away, that it wasn't right, but I couldn't. Instead, my body moved a little closer to his without even realizing it. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. I nodded, but his gaze wouldn't let me escape. He knew what was going on, and something inside me knew it too. The silence between us stretched on, heavy and charged with a tension that was impossible to ignore. Then, as if time had stopped, he leaned forward, and his lips touched mine. The kiss was gentle at first, a cautious exchange of affection, but it soon intensified, as if an electric current had ignited between us. My lips moved with his, without hesitation, without any more doubts. I knew what I was doing. I knew I was crossing a line that could no longer be undone. But I couldn't stop. When he moved one of his hands to my neck, gently pulling me closer, a wave of desire enveloped me. I gave myself over to the kiss, forgetting everything, everyone. The restaurant around us disappeared. The world outside disappeared. There was nothing else except the two of us and the growing fire between us. He pulled away for a moment, his eyes fixed on mine, and I could see the intensity of his feelings reflected in them. His breathing was fast, and so was mine. I felt a warmth pulsing through every cell of my body. That moment was everything I wanted most and everything I knew I had to avoid. "Sarah," he began, but didn't finish. His words were lost in the air, and I couldn't wait any longer. I kissed him again, this time with more urgency. I knew there was no turning back, that the line that had been drawn was now hopelessly blurred. The sensation of being touched by him, of feeling his arms wrap around me, making me forget everything that had worried me before, was intoxicating. His every touch was a relief, as if the loneliness that had consumed me for months was being replaced by an overwhelming passion. Dinner ended without another word. Matthew paid the bill, and we left for the parking lot. He walked me to my car, and the moment of separation seemed even more difficult than I had imagined. We hadn't said a word about what had happened between us, but we both knew that something had changed. He looked at me once more, his eyes shining with something I could no longer ignore. "Do you want to come over?" "Sure," he replied with a twinkle in his eyes. I got into the car, the engine starting with a low rumble, but my body was still vibrating with the intensity of what had just happened. Los Angeles was even quieter that night. The city around me seemed distant, irrelevant. I was in the middle of an emotional storm, and nothing else mattered. I didn't know what to do. The hours following Matthew's kiss were dragging on in my mind like a movie on repeat, but increasingly difficult to watch. When we arrived at my apartment that night, the feeling of adrenaline began to rush through our bodies, and it was only a matter of seconds before we were in bed. The following days were a mixture of pleasure and regret. Matthew and I kept seeing each other, now with increasing intensity. Every moment we spent together seemed to take me further away from everything I had known before. When he smiled at me, when his hands touched mine, I felt a deep connection, something I no longer knew how to explain. He wasn't just James's friend. He was becoming something much more real to me. Matthew and I were beyond friendship, beyond anything I could justify or explain. There was no going back, a secret of our own. That night was the last before an irreversible change. I knew somewhere deep inside me that I couldn't go back. The weight of my choice, of what I had done, was now something I would have to live with forever. No matter how much I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, the truth was clear. I had crossed a line. That's my little secret. What do you think? Should I continue with my adventure? Let me know in the comments and I'll see you next time. It's not over yet. Click on the cards and keep going.